November arrived at Bramblewick House the way a creditor arrives at a failing shop, without knocking, certain of its welcome, already counting what remained. It came first as damp in the stone, then as a grey that settled over the fields and did not lift, then as a cold that lived in the corridors and could not be sent away with any fire the household could still afford to build. The great rooms had been shut one by one over the years, their furniture draped in sheets that had gone the colour of old milk, so that walking through Bramblewick after dark was like walking through a house that was slowly, politely, forgetting itself. Eleanor Finch knew every one of those shut rooms by heart, because she was the one who had shut them. She was 26 years old, with chestnut hair pinned plainly beneath a plain cap, grey eyes that missed nothing and asked for nothing, and small, careful hands but were always faintly stained with ink at the first two fingers. Because it was Eleanor who kept the accounts that Mrs. Rutherford could no longer bear to read. She wore grey. She had worn grey for so long that the servants who were left had forgotten she had ever worn anything else. A soft, dove-grey wool that had been turned twice and mended more times than that, the colour of ash, after the flame is gone, but the warmth has not quite left it. It was not a colour anyone remarked upon. That was rather the point of it. Eleanor had learned young that a woman with no fortune and no beauty that announced itself was safest when she was not remarked upon, when she moved through a room the way weather moves through an open window, felt but not seen. And so she had made herself the colour of the walls and gone quietly about the work of keeping a dying house from dying too loudly. Her cousin, Mrs. Rutherford, who had taken her in after the collapse of her father's affairs, was not an unkind woman, only a tired and frightened one, and the two things wore very much alike from the outside. There were fewer logs for the fire now, fewer candles in the sconces, fewer courses at a dinner table that had once seated 20 and now seated 3 in the cold end nearest the hearth. Eleanor endured it. She endured the tradesmen's letters and the servants' notices, and the slow retreat of everything that had once made Bramblewick a house instead of a mausoleum. And she did it without complaint, because complaint was a luxury like sugar, one she had long since learned to do without. On the evening this story truly begins, a letter came that Eleanor did not want to open, because it was addressed in a hand she did not know, and sealed in wax the colour of dried blood. And letters that arrived looking important had, in her experience, only ever been important in the way a fever is important. She set it on the salver and carried it to Mrs. Rutherford, who read it twice, pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, and then began, softly and helplessly, to laugh. It was an invitation, a masquerade at Ashworth Hall, given by the Duke of Ashworth himself, and though the Rutherfords had not been noticed by such people in 20 years, some old thread of blood or obligation had tugged. And here was the card, gilt-edged and impossible, inviting the family of Bramblewick to attend. Mrs. Rutherford could not go. Her nerves would not stand it, she said, and her gowns were all a decade out of fashion. And besides, she said, looking at Eleanor with the particular calculation of the desperate, it was not the mother who ought to go to such a place, but the young. Eleanor understood. She understood the way she understood the accounts, quickly and without illusion. There were unmarried daughters in the world with dowries, and there were unmarried women like Eleanor with a mended grey dress and a talent for not being seen. And the invitation was, to Mrs. Rutherford, a lottery ticket that could only be redeemed by putting a young woman in front of wealthy eyes, and hoping. Eleanor did not want to go. She said so plainly once, and then, when she saw the frightened hope in her cousin's face, she said nothing more, because kindness in Eleanor was not a soft thing. It was a discipline, and it cost her, and she paid it. She would go. She would wear the one gown that could be made passable, a grey silk that had belonged to a woman now dead, taken in at the waist by Eleanor's own hand over 3 nights by a single candle. And she would stand at the edge of the Duke of Ashworth's ballroom, the way she stood at the edge of everything, watching, keeping her own counsel. And she would come home again, and put the grey silk away, and it would change nothing. That was what she believed as she sat by the last of the fire that night, mending the hem by a light too small for the work, the season pressing its cold face to the glass, the house holding its breath around her. She did not cry. She had not cried in a very long time. She only threaded the needle again and thought that the winter would be long and that she would outlast it the way she had outlasted every winter, plainly, quietly, and alone. She was wrong about the alone, but she did not know that yet, and neither did the man who had signed the invitation, with a hand that had not written a warm word to anyone in 3 years. Ashworth Hall, on the night of the masquerade, was a lie of light told against the dark. From the long drive it rose out of the November fog, blazing at every window, 1,000 candles at least, so that the fog around it glowed the colour of butter, and the great house seemed to float above its own grounds, like something that had escaped from a warmer, kinder world. Eleanor came to it in a hired carriage that smelled of other people's damp wool, wearing the grey silk and a half-mask of plain black that hid nothing but the edges of her eyes, and she stepped down onto gravel, already crowded with the shoes of people who belonged there in a way she never would. Inside, the noise met her like a wave, music and laughter, and the high, bright chatter of the fortunate, and the heat of so many bodies and so many candles, and the smell of hothouse flowers forced into bloom out of their season, roses in November, an extravagance that would have kept Bramblewick warm for a month. Eleanor did what she always did. She found the edge. There is an edge to every crowded room, a margin where the light is a little dimmer and the crush is a little thinner, and Eleanor had a gift for finding it and making herself at home there, a still grey figure beside a pillar, watching the bright wheel of the ball turn without her. She watched the beautiful women in their jewelled masks and their gowns like spun sugar. She watched the men who watched them. She watched a knot of guests near the great hearth part and reform around whatever they were discussing, and she caught, in the way one catches a cold, the shape of the conversation, because it was the shape of every conversation at Ashworth Hall that night. They were talking about the Duke. He was cold, they said. The Iron Duke, one lady called him behind her fan, and the others laughed the low laugh of people repeating a cruelty they have not earned. He had shut himself away for 3 years, they said, since the business with his brother, and he only opened the hall now because the old dowager had forced his hand, and it was well known, they said, that he had no heart to speak of, only a title and a great deal of money, and a face that could freeze the Thames. Eleanor listened, and felt something she was surprised to feel, which was not agreement, but a small, cold anger, because she knew what it was to be talked about by people who had never once spoken to you, to be summed up in a word by strangers and filed away. And she thought that whatever the Duke of Ashworth was, these people did not know it. They only knew the pleasure of deciding they did. She moved away from the hearth. She found a quieter door, and beyond it a quieter room, a small library, gone blue with moonlight and the dying of one lamp, and she stepped into it gratefully, the way one steps out of rain. She thought she was alone. She was not. A man stood at the far window with his back to her, tall, dressed in unrelieved black, a plain black mask, no jewels, no colour. A man who had also, it seemed, come looking for the edge of the room. Eleanor stopped. She ought to have gone, but something in the set of his shoulders, some weariness she recognized because she carried its twin, made her stay. And when he turned and saw her and did not send her away, she found that she stayed a while longer. They did not exchange names. That was the mercy of the mask, and both of them, for their own reasons, reached for it. He asked her, in a low, even voice, why she was not dancing. She told him the truth, because the mask made truth cheap and the moonlight made it easy. That she did not dance because no one had ever asked her, and she had stopped minding some years ago. He was quiet at that. Then he asked her what she thought of the ball, and here, Eleanor, who was tired and honest by nature, and lulled by the dark and the sense that this masked stranger was no one who could ever matter to her life, made the mistake that would remake it. She told him the truth about that, too. She said the ball was beautiful and false, that the roses in November were a cruelty dressed as a kindness, and that she had spent the last hour listening to a room full of people tear a man to pieces for the crime of being unhappy where they could see it. The stranger went very still. He asked her, carefully, which man? The Duke, she said. They call him cold, she said, the Iron Duke, and they say he has no heart. And I think it is the easiest thing in the world to say of a man that he has no heart, when what you mean is that he has not shown it to you, that he has not performed his grief for your entertainment. A man may be silent, she said, because he is empty, or he may be silent because he is carrying something too heavy to speak around. They have decided which, without asking. I do not think that is fair. The clock somewhere struck the first stroke of midnight. The stranger looked at her for a long moment. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. And then he said, in a voice gone strange and rough, that she was very sure of a man she had never met. Eleanor smiled a little, tiredly. I have not met him, she agreed. But I know what it is to be summed up by people who never asked. And she made him a small curtsy, and wished him a good evening, and left the blue library and its silent stranger, and went home in the damp carriage, and never once, on the whole cold road back to Bramblewick, suspected that she had spent the stroke of midnight defending the Duke of Ashworth to his own unmasked face. The summons came 11 days later, and it did not come gently. A crested carriage, black and silver, drew up in the Bramblewick Drive on a morning of hard frost, and sat there steaming, while a liveried servant carried to the door a letter that this time Eleanor did not have to wonder about, because the seal was the same dried blood red as the invitation, and the hand, she now understood with a lurch, was a hand she had stood beside in a moonlit library. The letter was addressed to her. Not to Mrs. Rutherford, not to the family, to Miss Eleanor Finch by name, and it requested, in 3 cold and courteous lines, the favour of an interview at Ashworth Hall at her earliest convenience, on a matter of business, and it was signed Ashworth. Mrs. Rutherford, when she understood, went white, and then pink, and then began at once to talk of dowries and settlements, and the extraordinary good fortune of it. And Eleanor let her talk, because she knew, with the cold, clear certainty that was her only inheritance from her ruined father, that whatever this was, it was not that. Men like the Duke of Ashworth did not summon women like Eleanor Finch to speak of settlements. She went. She wore the grey wool, not the silk, because the silk had been a costume and the wool was the truth. And she was received not in a ballroom, but in a study, lined floor to ceiling with books, where a fire burned low, and a man rose from behind a wide, dark desk to meet her. And it was, of course, the stranger from the window. Without the mask, he was not a comfortable man to look at. He was perhaps 35, tall, with black hair swept back from a high, pale brow, and a single, narrow streak of premature silver at the left temple. A hard, clean jaw, and eyes of so pale a grey that they seemed at first almost without colour. The eyes of a man who has looked at cold things for a long time. There was a thin white scar through his left eyebrow. He did not smile. He asked her to sit, and she sat, and he studied her across the desk for a moment with those pale eyes, as if confirming something. And then he told her, without preamble, why she was there. He was, he said, obliged to marry. His brother had died 3 years ago and left behind a daughter, a child of 6 now named Lucy, whose guardianship the Duke held only in part, contested by the child's maternal relations, grasping people who wished to take her and her small fortune into their own keeping. The court, and the terms of an unforgiving will, would look far more kindly on a guardian who kept a settled household, who had a wife, a lady of the house, a woman of good character, to stand as the child's mother in all but blood. He required, he said, such a wife. He did not require love, and would not insult her by pretending to it. He required a woman of sense, of discretion, of demonstrated kindness, a woman who would not flinch from a cold house, or a grieving child, or a great deal of unpleasant gossip. A woman, he said, who had shown him at midnight in a library that she could look at a man the world had decided to hate and see something the world had missed. He had made inquiries. He knew her circumstances. He was offering, he said, a marriage of convenience, plainly, without romance, an arrangement, a transaction. And in exchange, he would settle upon her a sum that would keep Bramblewick and its people warm for the rest of her cousin's life, and would ask of her only that she be, to the world and to the child, the Duchess of Ashworth. He finished, and was silent, and waited. Eleanor sat very still. Somewhere in her, a younger woman was weeping at the coldness of it, at being chosen the way one chooses a housekeeper, for her steadiness and her plainness and her usefulness. And Eleanor let that younger woman weep quietly when no one could see. And then she set her aside, because she was needed. She looked at the Duke. She saw the weariness she had recognized in the library, and she saw that he had not lied to her about a single thing, had not flattered her, or softened the truth to spare her feelings. And she found, to her own surprise, that she respected that more than she would have respected tenderness. She said she had conditions. Something flickered in the pale eyes, surprise, perhaps, or the ghost of interest. She said she would not be a decoration. If she was to be the child's mother in all but blood, then she would be her mother in fact, would raise her and love her and answer to no one in the matter of her upbringing. She said she would run his household as she saw fit, would open the shut rooms and let in the air, because she did not know how to live in a house that had given up. She said she would be honest with him always, even when honesty was unwelcome, because she did not have it in her to be otherwise, and he would do better to know it now. And she said, last, quietly, that she would keep his secret and stand at his side and give the world no reason to pity or despise him, but that she would not pretend, in private, to a warmth she did not feel, and would expect the same plain dealing from him in return. The Duke listened to all of it without moving, and when she had finished, something moved at the corner of his mouth, the smallest thing, not quite a smile, the almost of one. And he said that he thought they would understand one another very well. And that was how Eleanor Finch, in a grey wool dress, over the course of a single frost-bright morning, agreed to become a duchess for the price of a warm house and a child who needed a mother, and understood, walking out to the black and silver carriage, that she had just sold the rest of her life for other people's sakes, and did not know yet that she had also, without meaning to, begun to save her own. They were married quietly in the 3rd week of December in a cold, small chapel with no more than a dozen witnesses, and Eleanor wore grey, and the Duke wore black, and the whole affair had the muted, solemn quality of a transaction being formalized, which is precisely what it was. There was no wedding journey. There was only the removal of Eleanor and one small trunk from the failing warmth of Bramblewick to the vast, frozen grandeur of Ashworth Hall. And if the drive up to the hall had seemed, on the night of the masquerade, like an approach to a warmer world, the daylight told a different and truer story. Ashworth Hall, by day, was magnificent and dead. It was enormous, far larger than Bramblewick had ever been, and every inch of it was cold. Not the honest cold of poverty that Eleanor knew, but a stranger, colder thing. The cold of a place with every resource in the world, and no will to use them. A house where the fires were laid, but seldom lit, where the great rooms stood perfectly appointed and perfectly empty, where the servants moved on silent feet and spoke in the hushed, careful voices of people in a sick room. It was, Eleanor thought, standing in the enormous, echoing hall on her first afternoon as its mistress, a house in mourning for itself. The staff received her the way staff receive an unknown quantity, with flawless, correct courtesy, and not one degree of warmth. And Eleanor understood that, too, and did not resent it, because they did not yet know what she was, whether she was a fortune hunter who had trapped their grieving master, or a cold woman come to be cold at his side, and they were waiting, as sensible people wait, to find out. The housekeeper, a spare, upright woman named Mrs. Pell, showed her the house with the flat efficiency of a report being delivered, room after shrouded room, and Eleanor followed, and looked, and said little, and began, silently, to make a list, the way she had always made lists, of everything that was wrong and everything that could be mended. Chief among the things that were wrong was a small person she met on the second day, on the landing of the East Wing, a child of 6, with her father's black hair and a face gone pinched and watchful far past her years, dressed too neatly and standing too still, holding a rag doll by one arm as though she had been told not to and was defying the order in the only way she dared. This was Lucy, the Duke's ward, the reason for all of it, the child at the center of the cold house, and she looked at Eleanor with the flat, wary eyes of a creature that has learned to expect nothing and been proven right. And she said, in a small, clear voice, "Are you the new one?" Eleanor knelt down on the cold landing so that her grey eyes were level with the child's grey eyes, and she said, "Yes, I am the new one. And I am not very interesting, but I am extremely good at finding things that are lost, and if you ever lose anything, you may come to me." Lucy considered this. She held out the rag doll, wordlessly, and pointed to a small tear in its seam where the stuffing was escaping, and Eleanor understood that she was being tested, and took the doll, and produced from her pocket the small housewife of needles and thread that she was never without, and mended the seam then and there on the cold landing, small, neat stitches, while the child watched her hands with an attention that was almost hunger. When it was done, Eleanor gave the doll back, and Lucy took it, and looked at the mend, and looked at Eleanor, and did not smile, because she had plainly forgotten how. But she did not walk away either, and Eleanor counted that, privately, as the first small victory of a campaign she had not known until that moment she intended to fight. For she had decided something, kneeling on the cold landing with the mended doll between them. She had married the Duke of Ashworth for the sake of a warm house, and out of a stubborn kindness she could not entirely explain. But she would stay, she now understood, for the sake of this pinched and watchful child, and for the sake of the great cold house that had forgotten how to breathe. And she would do to Ashworth Hall exactly what she had told the Duke she would do. She would open the shut rooms and let in the air. She began the very next morning. She began small, because she was wise, and because the household was watching, and a woman who arrives and orders everything overturned makes enemies of the very people she needs. She began by asking Mrs. Pell, courteously, as a favor, whether the small morning room off the east front might be opened and its fire lit, because it caught the winter sun, and she thought the child might take her lessons there. Mrs. Pell, who had expected orders and received a request, looked at the new Duchess with the first flicker of something other than blank correctness, and said she would see to it. And the fire was lit, and the shutters were opened, and the pale winter sun came into a room that had been dark for 3 years, and fell across a dust-sheeted sofa, and Eleanor pulled the sheet away herself and shook it out the window, and sat the child down in the sunlight with a book, and that afternoon, for the first time in a long time, one room in Ashworth Hall was warm and occupied and alive. It was not much. It was one room in a house of 40. But Eleanor knew the secret that the whole cold house did not, which is that warmth spreads the way cold spreads, room to room, by touching, and that she had a great many rooms and a great deal of winter, and all the patience in the world. The Duke, in those first weeks, was a shadow at the edges of Eleanor's days, a tall, dark presence glimpsed at the far end of a corridor, or across the vast expanse of the dinner table, where they sat at either end of a board so long that conversation would have required raised voices, and so they did not converse, but ate in a silence that was not hostile, only immense. He kept to his study and his estate business, and whatever private grief lived behind his pale eyes, and he did not interfere with Eleanor's slow conquest of his house, and Eleanor, for her part, did not intrude upon his solitude, because she had promised him plain dealing and no false warmth, and she meant to keep both promises, even the ones that cost her. But she watched him, in the way she watched everything, and she began to gather the small evidence that told a different story than the Iron Duke of the ballroom gossip. She noticed that the fires were seldom lit in the great rooms, but always lit in the child's. That whatever economies of spirit the Duke practiced upon himself, he did not practice them upon Lucy. She noticed, going over the household accounts that Mrs. Pell surrendered to her with visible relief, small, strange entries that did not fit the picture of a cold man. A pension paid quarterly to the widow of a groom who had died in the Duke's service. The full wages of a stable boy who had been kicked by a horse and could no longer work, paid still, a year on, with no work asked in return. She found, tucked in the accounts like a pressed flower, the record of a man who did his kindnesses in the dark, silently, without credit, so silently that even his own household spoke of him as heartless, and Eleanor, discovering it, felt the small, cold anger of the ballroom return, and with it, something warmer and more dangerous that she did not yet examine. We will take a very short break here, and if you do not want to miss new stories like this one, please subscribe to the channel. Now, back to the cold house and the slow spring that was coming to it. The thaw between them, when it came by way of the child. Lucy had begun, over the weeks, to unfreeze, the way the morning room had unfrozen, slowly, a degree at a time, and she had transferred to Eleanor the whole hungry weight of a small heart that had gone 3 years without a lap to sit in, and she followed Eleanor through the house now, like a small grave shadow, and had begun, in the safety of the sunlit morning room, to laugh again, a rusty, startled sound, as though she surprised herself with it each time. And one evening, the Duke, passing the morning room on his way to his solitary dinner, heard through the door a sound he had not heard in that house since his brother died. The sound of a child laughing. And he stopped, and stood in the corridor with his hand on the cold wall, and listened, and did not go in. Eleanor found him there. She came out with a candle to fetch a book the child had asked for, and found her husband standing alone in the dark corridor, his hard face undone by something she had not seen on it before. And they looked at each other in the small light, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And then the Duke said, very low, that he had not thought to hear that sound again. And Eleanor, who might have said something graceful and retreated, chose instead to keep her promise of honesty, and said that Lucy laughed a great deal now, and that he might hear it whenever he wished, that the door was not locked, and that a child did not need to be earned, only visited. It was, perhaps, more than a wife of convenience ought to have said. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. 1 second, 2, 3, and Eleanor thought she had overstepped and prepared herself for the cold, civil rebuke she had earned. It did not come. Instead, the Duke, after a silence, told her a thing she had not asked for and had not expected. Told her, in the dark corridor with the child's laughter still faint behind the door, about his brother. His name had been Henry. He had been the warm one, the Duke said, the laughing one, the brother everyone loved, and the Duke had loved him more than anyone. And 3 years ago, Henry had died of a fever contracted, absurdly, senselessly, riding through a storm to bring a physician to a tenant's sick child. A child who had lived, while Henry had not, and the Duke had held the whole cold weight of it ever since. The estate, the title, the grieving orphaned girl, and the private, unspeakable knowledge that the world had lost the wrong brother, that the warm one was gone, and the cold one remained, and that he did not know how to be the thing his family now needed him to be, because he had only ever known how to be the silent one who stood at the warm one's side. He stopped. He seemed almost surprised to have said it, and Eleanor, standing in the candlelight, understood at last the whole shape of the man she had married, understood that the coldness the world despised was not absence but armor, the armor of a man who had decided that a heart which had lost so much was safer kept sealed away. And she did not offer him comfort, because he was not a man who would take it. But she offered him the truth instead, which was the only gift she had ever had to give. She said that she had not known Henry and could not speak for him, but that she did not believe the world had lost the wrong brother, because the wrong brother would not have paid a dead groom's widow her pension in secret, or wept in a corridor at the sound of a child's laughter. The warm brother, she said, had died doing a kindness. The cold one did kindnesses every day, and let the world call him cold for it. She did not think that was the lesser man. And she wished him a good evening, and went in to fetch the child's book, and left him standing in the dark. And something in the house shifted that night, some deep, frozen thing, and began, very quietly, to run. Spring came late to Ashworth that year, but it came, and it came first inside the house before it came to the grounds. The shut rooms opened one by one, sheeted furniture emerging pale and blinking into the light like sleepers waking. And the fires burned now in more than one grate, and the servants, who had watched the new Duchess with wariness through the winter, had begun by imperceptible degrees to thaw toward her as the house thawed, because they had seen what she did, and not merely what she said, had seen her sit with the sick scullery maid and mend the child's dolls, and treat the lowest of them with the same grave courtesy she gave the Duke. And a household knows the true measure of its mistress long before the world does. Eleanor had become, without quite noticing the moment it happened, the heart of Ashworth Hall. And the Duke had begun to come to the morning room. He came at first on the pretext of business, a question about the accounts that could have waited, and then he came without pretext, in the evenings, and sat in the chair by the window while Eleanor read to Lucy, saying little, only there, a tall, quiet presence in the warm lamplight. And the child grew used to him, and then glad of him, and then, one evening, fell asleep against his arm as he sat, and the Duke held perfectly still for an hour rather than wake her, and looked over the sleeping child's head at Eleanor, with an expression that neither of them named. They talked in those spring evenings. It began as talk about the child and the estate and the household, and became, slowly, the way a frozen river becomes a running one. Talk about everything. About the books that lined his study, about Eleanor's father and the ruin that had made her what she was, about Henry, whom the Duke could speak of now without his voice going strange, about the small, daily business of two people learning the shape of one another's minds. And Eleanor, who had married for a warm house and stayed for a child, discovered somewhere in the lengthening evenings that she had begun to wait for the sound of the Duke's step in the corridor, that the days felt provisional until he came, and she recognized the feeling for what it was, with a kind of quiet dismay, because she had promised him no false warmth, and here was a warmth that was not false at all, and she did not know what to do with it. And so she did what she always did, and said nothing, and kept it folded away in the grey quiet of herself. She did not know that the Duke had begun to do the same. She did not know that he had taken to finding reasons to walk past the morning room, that the sound of her voice reading had become the hour of his day he arranged the others around, that he had, one evening, watched her tuck the child in and cross the room in the lamplight in her plain grey wool, and thought, with the force of a blow, that she was the only warm thing in his whole cold life, and that he had married her by accident, and did not deserve her by any accounting he could make. The Iron Duke, whom the world believed had no heart, had given the whole of his, silently, in the way he did everything, to a grey woman who had defended him to his own masked face at midnight, and never learned it was him. Neither of them spoke. It might have gone on so for a very long time, two people orbiting a warmth they would not name, had the world outside the warming house not decided to intrude, as the world always does, in the person of someone who wanted what Eleanor had, and was prepared to be cruel to take it. Her name was Lady Seraphina Cole. She was everything Eleanor was not, and she knew it, and she had built her whole life upon it. She was beautiful, in the loud, announcing way, golden and glittering, and she was clever, in the way of people who have never had to be kind. And she had, for 2 seasons before Henry's death, considered the Duke of Ashworth her own particular property, had all but arranged in her own mind the triumph of becoming his Duchess, and had been waiting, with the patience of a hunter, for his mourning to end, so that she might complete the conquest. And then, into the 3-year silence, had come the news that the Iron Duke had married, quietly, without a season or a courtship, had married nobody, a penniless, plain relation of some ruined family, a grey little companion nobody had ever heard of. And Lady Seraphina Cole had received this news, the way a general receives the news that a fortress he considered already his has surrendered to a beggar. She did not believe it was love. She could not afford to believe it was love. And so she constructed, for her own comfort and for the ears of the world, a different story. The only story that made sense to a woman like her. That the grey companion was a schemer, a fortune hunter of the lowest and cleverest kind, who had trapped a grieving man in a weak moment, and that it was really the duty of Lady Seraphina, and of all right-thinking people, to see the poor Duke freed of her before she ruined him. It was a story with no truth in it at all. That did not matter. Lady Seraphina had learned long ago that a beautiful woman speaking with certainty need not trouble herself with truth, that the world will believe a well-dressed lie over a plain fact 9 times in 10. And she set about spreading her lie through the drawing rooms of the county with the patient skill of a woman sowing a field. A word here, a raised eyebrow there, a sorrowful confidence murmured to exactly the right gossip, until the story of the scheming grey Duchess who had trapped the poor Iron Duke was growing in every parlour for 20 miles. And Eleanor, warm at last in the house she had thawed, did not yet know that a frost was gathering just beyond its windows, with her name written on it. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth, the Duke's great-aunt Agatha, arrived at the hall in the 2nd week of May, unannounced, in a travelling coach that had been fashionable during the last king's reign, and she came, she said, to inspect the woman her great-nephew had been fool enough to marry without asking anyone's leave. She was 80 if she was a day, tiny and upright, and dressed in unrelieved black, with a face like a clever walnut, and a pair of black eyes that had been reading the true characters of foolish people for the better part of a century, and had never once been wrong. She frightened the servants. She frightened, a little, the Duke. She did not frighten Eleanor, who had spent her life among frightened people and had learned to tell the difference between a hard voice and a hard heart, and who received the terrifying old woman with grave courtesy and a good fire, and the child brought clean and shy to be introduced, and then sat down opposite her and let herself be examined without flinching, the way she let everything be examined. The Dowager looked at her for a long time. She looked at the grey wool dress and the ink-stained fingers and the plain, steady grey eyes, and she looked at the way the child had come at once to lean against the new Duchess's knee, and she looked, sharpest of all, at the way her cold great-nephew's eyes followed his grey wife about the room when he believed no one was watching. And the Dowager, who missed nothing, saw everything, and delivered her verdict that same evening over dinner in the carrying voice of the very old and very certain. She said that the county was full of fools. She said that she had heard, on the road, no fewer than 3 versions of the tale of the scheming little nobody who had trapped her great-nephew, and that she had come prepared to send the creature packing herself, and that she now found, having met the creature, that the creature was the only person of sense in the entire family, and that the fools who were spreading the tale had, as fools always did, precisely inverted the truth. She informed Eleanor, dryly, that she would be staying some weeks, that she found the house improved beyond recognition, and the child returned from the dead, and her great-nephew looking, for the first time in 3 years, like a man rather than a monument, and that she would like to know which of them intended to do anything about the obvious fact that they had fallen in love with each other, or whether they meant to go on being English about it until they died. Eleanor, to her own great mortification, blushed the colour of a winter apple, and the Duke, at the far end of the table, went very still, and the Dowager cackled with the pure delight of the old and the discomfort of the young, and said no more about it, having planted what she came to plant. But she did more than plant. She stayed, and she watched. And when the news reached even the Dowager's ears of exactly how far Lady Seraphina Cole's poison had spread, and of the great ball that Lady Seraphina was giving at the end of the month, to which all the county was invited, and to which the Duke and his shameful Duchess had been pointedly, insultingly not, the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth set down her teacup with a small, sharp click, and observed that it had been a very long time since she had enjoyed the destruction of a foolish woman, and that she intended to enjoy this one enormously. For the Dowager understood, as Eleanor in her plain honesty did not, the true nature of the attack. Eleanor had heard the whispers by now, had felt the county's warmth turn to frost around her when she went into the town, had seen the raised fans and the turned shoulders, and had borne it in her usual way, in silence, telling herself it did not matter, that she had the house and the child, and the strange warm thing with the Duke that neither of them would name, and that the opinion of strangers was a luxury like sugar. But the Dowager knew that it was not so simple, that a duchess, whom the county believed a schemer, could not raise the child, could not stand in the guardianship suit, that Lady Seraphina's lie was not idle malice, but a weapon, aimed with precision at the one thing that mattered, at Lucy, at the whole reason the marriage existed, and that if the lie were allowed to stand, it would take the child, and break the Duke a second time, and drive the Grey Duchess back to her ruined cousins in disgrace. This the Dowager explained to the Duke, privately, in his study, in the plainest possible terms, and the Duke, who had been letting the whispers pass over him in his old habit of enduring the world's contempt in silence, heard for the first time what was truly at stake, and something changed in his pale eyes that the Dowager, who had known him since his birth, had never seen there before. She had seen him cold, she had seen him grieving. She had never, in 35 years, seen the Iron Duke of Ashworth angry, truly angry, on behalf of someone he loved. And she saw it now. And she sat back in her chair, and she smiled a small, satisfied walnut smile, because she knew that Lady Seraphina Cole, whatever she believed, had just made the single gravest error of her glittering life. The Duke asked his great-aunt one question. He asked whether Lady Seraphina's ball was truly open to all the county. The Dowager said that it was, that the vain creature had invited everyone of any consequence for 30 miles, the better to display her triumph. Good, the Duke said. And that was all he said. But the Dowager, watching him, began to laugh. Lady Seraphina Cole's ball was the grandest the county had seen in a decade, and she had meant it to be, had spent without stint to make it so, because it was to be her coronation, the night the whole county gathered under her roof to acknowledge that she, and not the grey nobody, was the true queen of their small bright world, and that the Duke of Ashworth's marriage was a scandal to be pitied, and not a match to be honoured. Every candle blazed, every rose was forced into bloom, and the county came, all of it, glittering and expectant, hungry for the delicious spectacle of the fallen Duke and the ambition of the beautiful hostess who meant to redeem him. And the one thing that no one expected, the one thing that made the whole crowded ballroom fall silent between one breath and the next, was the sound of the door being announced, late, when the ball was at its full height, and the voice of the servant carrying across the sudden hush the words that Lady Seraphina had been most certain she would never hear beneath her own roof. His Grace the Duke of Ashworth, Her Grace the Duchess of Ashworth, and the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth. They had not been invited. That was the whole point, and everyone in the room understood it, and everyone in the room understood, watching the three of them enter, that something was about to happen that would be talked of for the rest of their lives. The Duke came in first, in black, with a single silver streak at his temple catching the light, and his pale eyes swept the silent room once, slowly, and where they passed, people found reasons to look at their shoes. On his arm came Eleanor. She wore grey. Of course she wore grey. She had always worn grey. But this was not the turned and mended wool of her poverty, nor the borrowed silk of the masquerade. This was grey silk of the Duke's own choosing, cut simply and perfectly, silver grey, the colour of a dove's breast, with no jewels but a single strand of pearls at her throat that had belonged, the older women present would whisper, to the Duke's mother. And Eleanor walked into the room that had been arranged to destroy her, with her chestnut head high, and her grey eyes calm, and her ink-stained hands steady. And she was not beautiful the way Lady Seraphina was beautiful, but there was something in her quiet that made the loud golden hostess look, suddenly, like a great deal of noise. And behind them came the terrible old dowager, in her ancient black, leaning on her stick, smiling at the room the way a fox smiles at a henhouse. Lady Seraphina recovered herself. She was not a fool, whatever else she was, and she came forward with her hands outstretched and her smile blazing, to turn the intrusion into a triumph of her own graciousness, to welcome the poor Duke and his unfortunate wife with a pity so public and so poisonous that it would do more damage than any snub. But the Duke did not take her hands. He stopped in the centre of the ballroom, in the great cleared space where the dancing had been, and he did a thing that the Iron Duke of Ashworth, who had not spoken 20 words in public in 3 years, had never in living memory done. He spoke. He spoke into the silence, and his low, even voice carried to every corner of the great room. And he said that he understood there was a story being told about his wife. He said he had come, uninvited, to correct it, because it was false, and because he had allowed too many false things to be said in his hearing for too long, out of a coward's love of silence, and he would not allow this one. He said that they called his wife a schemer, a fortune hunter, a nobody who had trapped a grieving man. And then he told them the truth, all of it, in the plain, unhurried voice of a man who has stopped being afraid. He told them how he had met her at the masquerade, a masked stranger in a library at midnight, and how she had not known him, and how he had asked her what she thought of the ball, and how she had told him, an unknown man behind a mask, that she thought the county was cruel to a man it had never troubled to know, that it was the easiest thing in the world to call a man cold, when what you meant was that he had not performed his grief for your entertainment. She had defended him, the Duke said, to his own face, believing he was no one, expecting nothing, gaining nothing. A schemer flatters the powerful. This woman had comforted a stranger she believed powerless, in the dark, when no one could see, and no advantage could be won. That, he said, was the woman they called a fortune hunter. He let that sit in the silence. And then he said the rest. He said that he had married her, yes, as an arrangement, coldly, for the sake of his brother's child, and that he would not pretend otherwise, because his wife had taught him that the truth plainly spoken was worth more than any comfortable lie. But he said that in the month since, in the house she had brought back from the dead, at the side of the child she had loved back to laughter, he had learned the thing that the whole glittering county in its cleverness had failed to learn, which was who she was. He said he had spent 3 years being called a man without a heart, and that he had half believed it, until a grey woman in a mended dress had walked into his frozen house and lit it room by room, and had asked nothing for herself, and had given everything, and had never once, in all that time, told him that she loved him, because she had promised him at the start that she would never offer him a false warmth, and had kept that promise so faithfully that she had hidden even the true warmth, for fear it might seem like a debt she was calling in. He turned, then, in the center of the silent ballroom, away from the county and toward his wife, and he spoke to her, in front of all of them, in a voice that had gone from public and carrying to something lower and rougher, and meant for her alone, though the whole room strained to hear it. He said her name. He said, Eleanor. He said that he had chosen her, at the first, not for beauty, because he had been too frozen to see it, and not for fortune, because she had none, and not for advantage, because she brought him nothing the world valued. He had chosen her, he said, for the one thing he had seen in a moonlit library, that she was a woman who told the truth to strangers in the dark and expected nothing for it, and that he had thought, coldly, that such a woman would at least be honest with him and would be kind to the child. He had married her as a transaction, he said. He had not known that a transaction could become a life. And he said, plainly, into the ringing silence, before the whole county that had come to see her destroyed, that he loved her, that he had loved her since a night in a corridor when she told him the world had not lost the wrong brother, and that he was done, entirely done, being ashamed to say so. Eleanor stood very still. The whole room was looking at her, and she saw none of them. She saw only the Duke, her husband, the Iron Duke, whom the world thought had no heart, standing in the center of a ballroom full of his enemies, with his heart entirely in his hands. And she understood that he had done this public and unbearable thing, this thing that cost his silent nature more than anyone in the room could know, for her, to defend her, to be seen defending her, so that no one could ever again say the story Lady Seraphina had told. And Eleanor Finch, who had not cried when her father was ruined, who had not cried when she was married off for the price of a warm house, who had made a discipline of not crying for so many years that the servants at Bramblewick had thought her made of colder stuff than she was, felt the tears come, and did not fight them, and let them fall. Because these were not the tears of grief she had spent her life refusing. She crossed the cleared floor to him, in her dove-grey silk, and she took his hands, and she said, so quietly that only he could hear it, the thing she had been keeping folded away in the grey quiet of herself since the spring. She said, "You saw me." She said, "No one has ever seen me, and you saw me." And the Iron Duke of Ashworth, in front of the whole silent county at last, and fully, and helplessly, smiled. Not the almost of a smile that she had been counting all these months, but the whole thing, the real thing, transforming his hard, cold face into something young. And he raised her ink-stained hands to his lips, and the ballroom that had gathered to watch a woman destroyed watched instead a man in love, and did not know what to do with itself. Lady Seraphina Cole stood at the edge of her own triumph, and understood, with the particular horror of the vain, that she had not defeated the Grey Duchess, but crowned her. That she had gathered the entire county to witness the one thing that would undo every word of her poison, and that she would be remembered now, not as the beauty who might have been a duchess, but as the woman whose cruelty had forced the Iron Duke to speak, and had given the county the greatest love story it would tell for a generation, with herself the villain of it. The Dowager Duchess, from the doorway, watched the ruin of Lady Seraphina Cole with the deep and tranquil satisfaction of the very old, and murmured to no one in particular that it was the best entertainment she had enjoyed in 20 years, and that she could now die happy, though she added that she did not intend to do so for some time yet. 1 year later, in the last warm gold of another autumn, Ashworth Hall stood with every window open to the mild evening air, and it was not the same house at all. The shut rooms were all open now, and lived in, and the gardens that had gone to ruin in the 3 years of the Duke's grief had been brought back by Eleanor's patient hand, the roses growing now in their proper season, and needing no cruel forcing. And the house that had once held its breath like a thing in mourning, breathed easily, in and out, full of light and footsteps, and the particular ordinary noise of a family that is not performing its happiness for anyone, but simply living inside it. Lucy was 7 now, and taller, and laughed without surprising herself, and called Eleanor mother without thinking about it, which was the only kind of victory in the whole story that Eleanor counted as complete. The guardianship suit had collapsed the way lies collapse when the truth walks into the room. For no court in the county would take a child from the Duchess, whom the whole county had watched being loved into her place. And Lucy's grasping relations had retreated, and the child was safe. And that had been, in the beginning, the entire point, though it had long since stopped being the only one. And in the evenings, when the child was asleep, the Duke and the Duchess of Ashworth sat together in the small morning room that had been the first room Eleanor ever thought, the room that caught the winter sun and now caught the autumn one. And they did not always talk, because they had reached the country beyond talk, where two people can sit in a silence that is not empty, but full. And the Duke would watch his wife in the lamplight, in the grey she still wore, because she had never stopped being the woman she was, only she wore it now like something chosen, and not something endured. And he would find, still, most evenings, the corner of his mouth doing the thing it had learned to do only since she came, the almost that had become, with her, the whole smile. On the anniversary of the masquerade, the Duke gave his wife a small wrapped thing, and Eleanor opened it, and it was a plain black half mask, the twin of the one she had worn the night she stepped into a moonlit library and told the truth to a stranger she believed powerless. And she looked at it, and looked at him, and the old grey eyes and the old pale ones met and held. 1 second, 2, 3, and she began, softly, to laugh. He said that he had thought of having it framed, so that they might remember. She said that she did not need it framed, that she remembered perfectly, that she remembered a tired man at a dark window who had asked her what she thought of the world, and had received, for his trouble, more truth than he had bargained for. He said that it was the best bargain of his life, and that he had thought a great deal, in the year since, about how nearly he had never made it, how easily he might have stayed at that dark window and let her walk out of the library and out of his life, a grey stranger he would never have known he lost. He said the thought frightened him more than anything the world had ever done to him, more than his brother's death, more than the long, cold years, because a man may survive a grief he can name, but he did not know how a man survives the quiet, ordinary loss of a happiness he never knew was waiting one room away. And Eleanor said that he need not think of it, because he had not let her go, because he had turned from the window when he might have stayed silent, and that all the rest of their life together was built on that one small turning, the smallest of choices, a man deciding, in the dark, to speak to a woman in grey, rather than let her pass. He said that he had gone to that window, a man made entirely of winter, and had left it, though he had not known it yet, already beginning to thaw, because a woman in grey had told him in the dark that a silent man might be silent from a full heart, and not an empty one, and had been, as she was about most things, exactly right. And Eleanor Finch, who had once believed that she would move through the whole of her life the way weather moves through an open window, felt but not seen, and would outlast every winter plainly and quietly and alone, sat in the warm gold light of the house she had brought back to life, beside the man who had seen her, holding the mask that had begun it all, and knew that she had been wrong about the alone, gladly and completely wrong, and that there are some winters a person is not meant to outlast by enduring, but by being, at long last, let in from the cold. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Please tell us in the comments which city you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And if it warmed something in you, do not forget to subscribe so that you will not miss the new stories still to come.